Okay, on a more highbrow note, I want to bring in Niall Ferguson, who is the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and who's the author of the new book, The Square and the Tower. President Trump says he won by bypassing the hierarchies that opposed him and organizing a network of supporters that other Republican politicians like Mitt Romney couldn't. And that's one reason Niall's book, which looks at the balance of power through history between top-down hierarchies and bottom-up networks, is particularly timely. Niall, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So your thesis is that we're in a time where the hierarchies are in decline, and you seem pretty alarmed by that. Why?
Well, I think we were told over the last 20 or so years by the folks in Silicon Valley that everything would be awesome if we were all connected, and that creating giant online social networks would lead to a global community. I think that's Mark Zuckerberg's phrase. But history and network science rather argue against that happy outcome. And part of the point of this book is to draw a series of analogies with previous periods when technology has empowered social networks relative to established hierarchies of governance. The big analogy that I point to is with the period of the Reformation. Martin Luther would not have been able to challenge the Roman Catholic hierarchy had there not been printing presses all over Europe to disseminate his words. Luther thought that if he could only get scripture to ordinary people in the vernacular, they'd have a direct relationship to God without a corrupt priesthood in between, and you'd get that wonderful priesthood of all believers that the Bible talks about. Well, actually, he got 130 years of religious conflict in Europe that dragged on into the middle of the 17th century. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that that's not too surprising, because we know that large networks don't tend to be homogeneous, they tend to be polarized. And that polarization effect, or self-segregation into clusters, is what we also see in our own time, where it's politics that has been transformed by the advent of giant online social networks.
So, but when looking at the Reformation, obviously there were also substantial upsides to it, right? It was a reaction against a Catholic Church that had come to be abusing its position as a hierarchy. So isn't there something to be celebrated about these networks when they're able to disrupt a hierarchy that is not acting in the best interest of the public? What's the way to harness the upside of that network power without all of the strife and war that we saw in the Reformation?
Yeah, as somebody who's kind of against polarization, I'm also against false dichotomies, and the book actually tries to show that there isn't a simple dichotomy between square and tower, network and hierarchy, that there's a kind of continuum from completely distributed, decentralized networks to extraordinarily centralized hierarchical networks. The point I'm making is not that social networks are bad. It's just that if you create large social networks, you shouldn't expect a kind of happy, clappy feeling of warm togetherness. A good illustration of this is that it's not just science that goes viral in the 17th century, it's also notions of witchcraft. And there's this kind of crazy notion that there are witches everywhere that sweeps through places where the Reformations happened, leading to enormous numbers of witch burnings. So the book is trying to say, let's not have a kind of binary view of social networks, that they're either all good and going to create a global community or all wicked. As so often in history, there's a kind of balance sheet, and you have to recognize, as I don't think we did when, say, Facebook was being created, that there are risks to a completely distributed social network without any real hierarchical control.
I take Niall's point, and Niall, congratulations on the book, that he
Thanks.
is not promoting a simplistic polarity here. But I would just go back to the example of the Reformation. Yes, there are downsides, I think, to every social movement and technological advance. But I think the general tendency is the more information, the better. The translation of the Bible into English was an amazing event. The rise of a print culture in England that eventually came over to these shores created a more liberal society and undermined attempts to create a hierarchical, absolutist type monarchy of the sort you saw on the continent. So I think it's very difficult to identify any of these trends and just say they're bad, because it goes to human nature. They're mixed.
I'm curious your thinking, because the big Silicon Valley tech companies, Google, Facebook, have become so powerful, have begun to make their weight felt politically, which you write a little bit about in the book. Some of it is because they're so lightly regulated. you point out they're not subject to the same kinds of law as other information or content providers. What kind of regulation would you suggest is needed to limit their power to protect the public from the way they use their dominant positions in the context of hierarchy, in the context of networks?
The structure of the public sphere has been dramatically altered in around a decade, not least by the advent of Facebook, something which now provides about 45% of Americans with their news. And that makes Mark Zuckerberg the most powerful publisher of content probably ever, certainly more powerful than William Randolph Hearst at the height of his power. And yet, as you rightly observe, there's an anomaly in the regulation dating back to before Facebook, before Mark Zuckerberg even got to Harvard, to the mid-1990s, essentially exempts the network platforms, as they like to call themselves, from any liability for the content that appears on their sites. And that means that the playing field certainly isn't level, and that skew has, I think, helped the network platforms establish their dominance, not least in online advertising. There's a big debate, which you'll all be aware of, about antitrust and whether these companies are monopolies or near monopolies and should be broken up. I suspect that's the wrong debate, because certainly as I understand the existing state of the law, it would be quite hard to show on the basis of our current understanding of antitrust that there is a disadvantage to consumers from the way Google and Facebook, or for that matter, Amazon, operate. But I think this issue of regulation being basically asymmetrical and advantaging the Silicon Valley companies is a huge one. And I'm quite surprised there's not more discussion of this, given the enormous political power that these platforms now exercise. I don't think the election of 2016 is intelligible without the recognition that Facebook is the most powerful tool for political advertising ever invented. And without it, I don't think Donald Trump could have won that election. If we simply leave things as they are, I think we are in a completely unstable environment in which the network platforms become the public sphere, and they don't just generate enormous revenue from it. They can be instrumentalized by any good or bad political actor with the kind of targeted advertising that essentially breaks up the public sphere. Sam Lessin wrote a great essay about this on The Information not so long ago, making the argument that we're all worried about echo chambers or filter bubbles, but actually it's the total fragmentation of the public sphere, so that each of us gets the news feed that the algorithm thinks we most want to see and will most engage us. There is no public sphere in that state of affairs, and there's no way of monitoring what your neighbor is being told reality is out there. I don't think we're fully digesting the implications of what happened in 2016. Maybe it has to happen a couple of more times before we wake up and say, hang on a minute, something fundamentally unstable is being created.
We've reached that time once again for our famed left, right, and center rants featuring pet peeves from across the political spectrum. Rich Lowry, it's your soapbox.
When the Clive and Bundy standoff happened in 2014, I think most of us assumed that the rancher and his supporters were lying about the various abuses that they alleged by the federal government. Well, now it turns out a federal judge has tossed the criminal case against Bundy based on flagrant abuses by the federal government. It goes to show that the old adage is true, that even paranoiacs have enemies.
Katrina, what's your rant?
Ready for an anti-Trump wave this November? Check out Wisconsin. Trump's defenders like to claim his base is so blindly loyal that nothing he says or does will ever drive its members away, but news from across the country should shatter that view. A large majority of voters, including erstwhile Trump supporters, is rebelling. That message was delivered this past Tuesday in the rural 10th Senate District in Wisconsin's western reaches, where Democratic Patty Schackner defeated a GOP assemblyman by an impressive 9 points in a special election. Trump carried that district by 17 points in the last presidential. Seat had been held by a Republican for 17 years, and it was the Dems' 34th legislative pickup from Republicans since Trump's election.
For my rant, I want to applaud Delta Airlines for their announcement of a new policy cracking down on fake service animals. Delta says customers have attempted to fly with comfort turkeys, possums, snakes, and spiders. You are entitled under federal law to bring an emotional support animal on board a plane without a carrier. But since you can get an ESA certification online for any animal for about $200, many people are abusing the law to bring their pets on board. Delta will now require a signed certification that your so-called emotional support animal has been trained to behave. This isn't a big barrier in itself. The pet owner can sign their own certification, but hopefully it will induce a sense of shame for people who are abusing a benefit that's supposed to be for people with disabilities. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Rich Lowry, Katrina Vanden Heuvel, Shia Cabas, Tom Nichols, Betsy Woodruff, and Niall Ferguson. Sarah Fay produced today's program. Our technical director is JC Swadek. Katie Burskins and Colin Cab-Washington are our production assistants. Todd M. Simon composed our theme music. I'm Josh Barrow. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next week for more Left, Right, and Center.
Download and subscribe at kcrw.com/LRC, the KCRW app, or wherever you find podcasts. Left, Right, and Center is produced and distributed by KCRW.